actually recording. So this is everybody's warning. We are recording now, so we all have to behave. Welcome everybody to our learning community today, which is harm reduction, and we're going to look at it from a holistic view. So we won't be talking about only harm reduction in the traditional sense, which a lot of us think of, kind of applying to the world of substance abuse treatment or substance use disorders. We're also going to broaden that scope and look at how we can utilize, or how self-harm can show up in supportive housing settings, and also some of the interventions that we can utilize to intervene. We'll also have some time for a group discussion. So I want to welcome all of you. Our lead trainer today will be my colleague Ken Kinter, and I will be here to chime in and help with tech as needed. I am Dawn Reinhardt Wood, and obviously we are from Rutgers University out on the East Coast, and happy to be with you here again today. So just a few housekeeping items, just to remind you all that as you enter the training, you're muted and your cameras are off, but please know that if you'd like to ask a question, if you just, pop up in the chat or raise your hand from the participant, I think it's the participant box. Let me see. Yeah, participant list. We will call on you, and then you can go right ahead and turn your mic on, and because we do prefer hearing your voices and not only ours. Or if you're comfortable or don't have a mic, you can obviously type your comment or your question in the chat box. So without further ado, let's move past the housekeeping. Like I did say, let me go back one moment. This will be recorded, and the link to the recording and the slides, the handout of the slides will be made available to your leadership in Washington, and they will send that out to everybody who is on the registration, or I believe the attendee list. And you can feel free to share any of the materials that you receive with your colleagues, friends, family, whoever. So I will go through the learning objectives here, and then I will turn this over to Ken. So today we're going to look at some of what I think that most of us have in our mind when we think about harm reduction and how it relates to self-harm, right? So very often when we hear the words harm reduction, we think about addiction services, meeting people where they're at, reducing the harm of either addictive behaviors or the use of addictive substances. We also think about ways in which we can intervene and mitigate damage from self-mutilation, self-harm, and other sorts of parasuicidal behaviors, which we will get into more. So those dangerous behaviors that may not be an overt suicidal gesture, but some of those behaviors that are telling us that a person's in distress. So we're going to look at those traditional domains of harm. And then we'll also kind of branch out and look at this more holistic view of harm and harm reduction, and what it can look like in the community settings, specifically in housing settings, whether it is supportive housing or other residential settings, or even in non-supportive housing, difficulties that individuals that we serve may have with peer relationships and sexual relationships or other close relationships, family, friends, including things like one's apartment becoming the new shelter for their friends and family, and other issues like hoarding as well. So, and any other examples that you all might have from your work. So without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Ken. And Ken, if you like, I'll continue to advance the slides for you. If you just let me know. Ken, are you there? Oh, I think I might have to promote him or something.
Can you hear me now?
I can hear you. Thank you.
Beautiful. Hey, I feel I'm officially promoted. I'm happy about that. Although I think I was muted. So as I was saying to myself, don't So she's going to be helping in a whole lot more areas than just tech. My experience is primarily in crisis. So usually my involvement comes when someone's tenancy is at an end. And we are, so we're hoping to discuss both sides of that, because the goal here is to extend someone's tenancy. Dawn and I both work in the hospital project here in New Jersey. And one of the things we really like is when people get placed somewhere and it works, so that that person doesn't have to return to the hospital and go through all of that stuff, particularly over and over again, the revolving door style. So we're going to be talking about both sides of that. And Dawn's going to specifically be talking more about the relational aspect of that. As she mentioned, we're going to discuss briefly the traditional forms of harm reduction, but we're going to spend more time on those other things that really threaten people's tenancy. And we're specifically going to be asking all of you for some scenarios and suggestions and situations that you're dealing with, because there's lots of ways to get kicked out of where you live. And we're going to be covering some of the big general ones, but we also want to have time for specific things. So I also understand there's some harm reduction stuff that's being scheduled substance-wise in your near future. So I think there's going to be a lot more work in that area. So part of the philosophy behind harm reduction is that sometimes abstinence is way too high of a bar to set for people. And in a way, it's almost unique to addictions. And it's even been equated with being discriminatory to some degree. Could you imagine having people that have diabetes in a program, but we have to say, okay, well, you got to have your diabetes stabilized before you can come in? Why do they need the treatment if they have already, gotten to a place where they are abstinent, or, in a place where they are, stable from their symptoms? So it's sort of unique, and it may be an unrealistic expectation for people. So we're excluding the very people that we want to actually treat. To me, it reminds me of the no wrong door philosophy, where if someone has, say, bipolar disorder and an addiction, the mental health provider tells them to get sober and then come in for the treatment for bipolar disorder. The substance abuse treatment center says, well, you got to get your bipolar disorder situation stable before you come in for help. So substance abuse is the only field where we require the absence of active symptomatology before entering treatment. And that's not very realistic in many cases. Next slide, please. So, and the situation, as we're going to talk about, is that the behaviors that we're going to be talking about, the behaviors that you see in housing, come from a pretty complex level of problems. For example, you see lots of addictive behavior that may result in somebody losing their housing. So obviously the addiction is there. But underneath that level of addiction, there is a level of psychiatric symptoms going on. What is the thing that they're medicating? The absolute chicken and egg argument. I have a great graphic about that I wish I had brought in. So you're absolutely right, Wanda. So there's the addiction. What's one of the things that makes the difference between someone who uses a substance and someone who has a substance use disorder? And that is the idea that they're medicating something. One of the things that they're medicating are the underlying symptoms of mental illness. And how do we find out about those things? Well, when that person gets any period of sobriety going on, these things come back. Voices, mood swings, anxiety, depression, you name it. And then what we find is you get another layer deeper than that, and there's the trauma layer. And this is the common ancestor of both the chicken and the egg. I've heard it argued that it's not the chicken, it's not the egg, it's the reptile that eventually evolved into a bird. So trauma tends to be at the core of a lot of these things. So the behaviors that you're seeing are coming from this multi-layer thing. And we're going to have to deal with all of those layers. And that's one of the reasons why it's so complicated and so complex. But what I will say is that when people do make progress on the trauma, that core aspect of it, you start to see relief at multiple levels. I do a lot of addictions work. And once you get to that trauma piece, the battle is never over. I should say the war is never over, but the outcomes definitely change when a person makes some progress in that area. Next slide, please. So in the way of this approach, as it comes to working in addictions, some of you may have heard of this before. I apologize if this is old news, but this is something that's been used in process addictions where, abstinence may not even be possible. So let's take an example like someone who's a compulsive shopper or is sex addicted, abstinence probably isn't even an option on the table. A person doesn't want to become celibate, nor are they going to be able to stop shopping for the rest of their life. So how do we tweeze out these behaviors into different domains according to safety? So what you have here, you have a little graphic here that is a 3 circles approach for someone with gambling addiction. So the outer circle, the green level, is healthy behaviors. And you'll notice that some of these have to do with gambling support, and some of them don't have anything to do with it. They're just healthy things: meditation, exercise, journaling. So those are the healthy behaviors that keep somebody well. The middle circle is the kind of slippery slope behavior. In AA, they would talk about this being dancing around the fire. You know, you haven't really done the thing. It's the alcoholic in the liquor store or in the bar. They haven't had anything to drink yet, but they're right there, you know, right around the fire, as it were. And these middle circle behaviors can be external or internal. For example, they can be internal states. I'm sure you guys have heard of HALT before. And that's an AA thing, that people are very likely to relapse when they're hungry, angry, lonely, and tired. And I've actually heard that elaborated into HALT BS: hungry, angry, lonely, tired, bored, and stressed. They belong, right? They think about, for me, I know that I medicate somewhat with quite a bit with food. And when I'm not only hungry, but angry, lonely, tired, bored, and stressed, I am at risk, definitely at risk. Dawn and I are both working on our dissertations right now. So let's talk about the stress that leads to those sort of behaviors. I don't want to speak for her, but there we are. We work together. So the middle circle behaviors can be internal or external. So for example, if you're addicted to gambling and you watch TV now for about 2 minutes, what are the odds that you're going to see an ad for sports gambling? I almost defy you to watch 2 minutes of TV without one of those commercials coming on. It's almost impossible. So that is an external trigger. Then we have the internal triggers, the inner circle, which are considered the bottom line behaviors. This is where the relapse has actually happened. So part of what this harm reduction aspect is, what are those behaviors that are outer circle, that are healthy, that are middle circle, that are slippery slope, and then inner circle, which are dangerous. So for example, the same behavior might be middle circle if it protects someone from going inner circle. So for example, if I'm probably the classic example is someone who quits smoking. It's almost universal that someone who quits smoking gains weight, right? What just happened? They just took a behavior that was less harmful and substituted it, you know, in an attempt to mitigate that, because they say, okay, if I put on 10 or 15 pounds, that's bad, but it's a better alternative than just relapsing on smoking again. So that's a pretty classic example of how that all works. Next slide, please. So self-injurious behavior, we'll start off with these traditional examples. So what is the why of the self-injurious behavior? There's lots of reasons why people do these self-injurious behaviors. Again, we'll go back to the trauma piece. Sometimes there is some benefit to the attention that people get. Sometimes it's the turning of emotional pain into physical pain. Sometimes there's some other secondary gain. And then sometimes it's a response to a triggering event or situation. I'll give you a great example of this we had from the hospital. We had a woman in the hospital who did frightening things to herself, not to kill herself, but just to injure herself. And again, this is in a state hospital, a pretty restrictive setting. She always did it before going to bed, within an hour of going to sleep. Now, there's probably light bulbs going off all over the place already, because you probably know what the answer to this is. This is someone who was a survivor of sexual abuse, and she was sexually abused while she slept. So she made the connection between I'm going to bed to, and of course she's in a state psychiatric hospital, let's keep that in mind, to I'm moving into a dangerous situation. And so all of this acting out would happen that hour before. And of course, that's a time in the hospital where we don't have everybody around. So the challenge becomes, how do we address that triggering event? How do we help that person to feel safe? What is something we can do to mitigate that stressor? or to change how that person interprets that situation so that they're safe. So this is where you get into that. What's the thing that leads to that behavior? And then what is it that they get from that behavior? And how do we change that dynamic so that that doesn't continue? Next slide, please.
Oh, and I think I have the next slide, and I just wanted to touch on this slide for a moment. And Ken just said it. You know, when we say attention, you know, in terms of the why, very often that's thrown around as something negative. It is also something that I have probably said early on in my career, especially when working with individuals who may suffer from or live with borderline personality disorder, and may be more likely to engage in what we traditionally think of as self-harm or self-injurious behavior. As Ken just said, you know, somebody either injuring themselves or in the process of trying to protect themselves, injuring themselves to prevent, or because they're being triggered by a trauma like sexual abuse, or, you know, individuals who may act out, we say, quote unquote, act out for attention, you know, head banging and things like this. And maybe you're not seeing such severe behaviors such as like head banging or that in the residences, but I think probably it does, you know, other forms of self-injury does happen. But this assertion that it's only for attention, or that it's for attention, and the connotation sounds negative, you know, or manipulative. But the one thing that I really want to stress is that, you know, looking at the absence of attention that individuals have, and tracing that back to why, you know, we may need to plan constructive, structured attention for some individuals to get ahead of, you know, reinforcing this behavior that you will only get attention when you do something harmful to yourself.
It's a great point. If I could add two pieces to that, I don't know, I can't speak to the system in Washington, but I know in New Jersey, we are a crisis-driven system. So we are a little slow to attend to things that are on an ongoing basis, and it tends to be putting out one fire after another. So there's a place where you can look at self-injurious behavior as adaptive in a way, two ways that I can think of. One is because if you aren't comfortable just saying, hey, I need help, I need to talk to somebody, I need to sit with somebody before I can go to sleep because I don't feel safe, this becomes a behavioral way of getting that communication across. The other piece of that is, let's look at this from a harm reduction perspective. Self-injurious behavior may be a step down from that person literally attempting suicide. Very often, as much as self-injurious behavior starts and develops over time, some people go to that instead of something that's more dangerous. So even that may be a modification of behavior. So there is a place to look at it from a cry for help perspective, rather than, oh, I'm being manipulated, I'm being played, you know, this person's just doing this.
And it does help you with your own compassion.
Yeah.
Right. Let me see. Oh, okay. Hi, Tracy. Welcome. No problem. Thanks for letting us know. Tracy's logged in under 2 devices. That is how dedicated she is. She is a true professional. Thank you, Tracy.
And we relate to technical issues, Tracy. We definitely
it's okay. So yeah, so this idea that self-injurious behavior, it can also be viewed as a protective behavior. So we also have to keep that in mind when attempting to extinguish the behavior or stop the person from engaging in what we see or what we know to be self-injurious or self-injurious behavior or self-harming behavior. Because again, you know, what are we going to replace that behavior with? So like Ken said earlier, it also relates to those concentric circles, right? So if we stop the scratching of the arm or the, you know, the cutting, what are we then going to substitute that behavior with? We need something to substitute with that's going to be at least equally or less lethal, you know, and hopefully more constructive. I don't know, Ken, did you want to clean up anything I said or?
Well, I think we're going to get to that, but yeah, that's
Okay.
that's an excellent point.
Okay, so moving on. So let's talk very briefly about relationships. And I was hungry when I found the graphic for this slide. So hence we have a box of chocolates. So Relationships are like a box of chocolates and you never know what you're going to get, right? So when we think about relationships and when we talk about harming type behaviors, and we talk about self-harm behaviors in terms of the relationships we keep, what we're talking about specifically as it relates to supportive housing is, wanting to nurture and encourage our service recipients to engage in relationships, not only romantic, but close, supportive relationships, which may also include romance and a sexual relationship, but also, helping them learn how to manage all of the relationships in their life. And as we all know, our families can be complicated. Um, Sometimes some folks choose alternate families of choice, rather than families of origin, because we do know that it can be complicated. And one of the things that we can see fairly often when we serve individuals in a community is it can get complicated real fast. You know, how tricky some of these relational systems are. And let me move forward and kind of tease that out a little bit more. So we know that having a healthy, close relationship can have a positive effect on an individual's recovery process, whether it be psychiatric recovery exclusively, or we're talking about substance use disorders. Healthy, supportive relationships do support recovery. This also includes intimate relationships. And I'm talking about sexually intimate relationships as well. And it's something that in the field of housing can get complicated really fast, because I know that, supportive housing all over the country very often utilizes rental subsidies, and you may have addendums on, or maybe not addendums on lease agreements, but you have restrictions on leases in terms of who can occupy a unit, as anyone would have if they leased an apartment or a residence. Excuse me. And yet, what does that do for the individuals that we're working with? It can impose some challenges to them on, cultivating and maintaining healthy, intimate relationships. Sometimes also, individuals get into relationships that are not healthy. And this could be intimate or otherwise. People can get into relationships or remember, individuals who were there for them when they were having a difficult time. This is a phenomena that I saw in my work in supportive housing over and over and over again, where individuals want to help folks who helped them when they were homeless, or when they were in the hospital, or when they were in a program together, or they were struggling or at a difficult point in their addiction, right? So they open up their couch or they open up their apartment to this individual or individuals, and it may be family. And then we're in the position of having to remind folks that it's wonderful to be nice and it's wonderful to be a caring human being, but you're also putting your subsidy at risk, you're putting your apartment at risk. And so this is a difficult dance that we do as service providers, because whereas we want to nurture people, and we want individuals to be decent human beings, we also have to look out and remind them of some of the limitations that there is in terms of housing. There may be family issues that individuals find themselves in once they leave a hospital, exit homelessness, and enter into a more stable living situation. Very often they may become a magnet for not only these friends who they may have helped in the past, but family who may have leaned on them because they occupied certain roles in their family, whether they be the person that was always blamed for problems, or whether they be the fixer, the one who rescues folks. These are things that we have to keep in mind. And I think it's a good idea to really understand, if the client or if the service recipient will open up about it, some of the ways in which family has influenced their daily lives. Sexual health as well. So Again, sexuality is a normal part of human life. If it wasn't, we would not be here. Not that we want to think about that right now. But if sexuality wasn't a normal part of life, we wouldn't be here. There is also evidence that a healthy sexual life also contributes to psychiatric recovery. And so again, this is something, Ken talked briefly about sexual addiction. Sex is also on a continuum when it comes to healthy behaviors and not so healthy behaviors. So again, this is an area that we want to pay attention to, and especially in the area of disease prevention and the prevention of exploitative or manipulative sexual relationships and other relationships.
If I could just jump in about that, just a few things. One thing to look at, back to Dawn's earlier point, is when someone is engaging in a behavior that doesn't appear to make any sense. One of the things I always try to do is look back and say, okay, this person came from some sort of family, some sort of dynamic where this made sense. For example, we had a gentleman who would take all of his coats and hide in the corner under a ping pong table. And he would just make this nest of coats in the corner and stay underneath there. And everybody was like, okay, he's psychotic and this and that. And this is why he's doing this. So that orientation dictated how they approached him. Well, the reality of the situation is this person was used to having all of their materials stolen and had actually been severely beaten in a previous treatment setting. So it sounds a lot less psychotic when you put it in the context of that dynamic, right? This was actually protective. This person was acting in a manner to try to protect themselves. And then our approach, in addition to being a little more compassionate, was a little more effective because we came from a perspective of, well, let's increase this person's feeling of safety rather than, all right, let's just medicate them more and hope this behavior goes away.
Sorry about that, Ken.
So now a picture of Dawn's in my office.
This looks like my house right now.
Actually, this was a specific request that we add this aspect in, because normally people don't think about this in terms of harm reduction, but I am sure that it's a situation that you all are dealing with, and we even deal with it in the hospital setting for people that are anxious, and for people that are, as I was just saying, maybe there are people that have lost their things before. They tend to collect and hold on to things. And I'm sure that you're working with people now whose hoarding behaviors may have impacted their tenancy, makes them more difficult to work with, and ultimately can cause people to lose where they live. So that's another issue. And of course, anyone who's had to deal with this head on knows, you make a little bit of progress, you clean out one area, and of course that person either brings everything back into that spot again, or they promptly fill it with other stuff. So this is another issue, and we'll talk a little bit more about this in a bit as far as possible interventions.
So this is more of a broader look at harm reduction programs. So, we earlier we had mentioned, traditionally we think of harm reduction very often we think about it from the substance abuse treatment or substance use treatment perspective. And so one example is the use of medication assisted treatment. So for individuals who have opiate use disorders, one of the things that is done is the use of products or pharmaceuticals such as methadone, which has been around for a very long time. I believe that was the first to be used to help with opiate addictions. And naltrexone and buprenorphine. And these are, this is an example from the Pennsylvania, I almost said Philadelphia, Pennsylvania Department of Corrections. So these are, being given out in prisons, and they're being given out in mental health, community mental health programs, and in doctors' offices that are licensed to dispense it. But these help by curbing cravings and also doing what? You see needles up in the upper right-hand corner. Needle distribution or clean needle exchange is also another harm reduction approach, right? So the idea is, and it can be controversial, especially in neighborhoods where it happens. In North Philly, near where I live, the Kensington section is one of the hottest sections in the country for open air heroin sales. And there are several needle exchanges in the area. One of the complicating or one of the consequences is people are finding needles all over the street, right? So it's not without drawbacks, which is why they also created houses where individuals can go in and utilize their works and medicate. But it is an attempt at harm reduction to hopefully reduce the spread of infection, right? So, and we also see here then, following clockwise, free condoms. Again, knowing that the majority of individuals are not going to be abstinent, it's an attempt at harm reduction to stop the spread of STIs or sexually transmitted infections and or unintended pregnancy. Can anybody think of any other harm reduction approaches that maybe you know of or you've utilized that maybe we haven't mentioned that are traditional or maybe less traditional? Ken, are there any that I missed on here?
It's funny, Dawn, I was just thinking off the top of my head when my first job with the university, we were doing research on fast food. And during that time, Wendy's started offering orange slices instead of having fries with a burger. And I remember thinking, is that harm reduction? Wait, well, yeah, isn't it?
So, yeah, and Sarah just said caffeine instead of alcohol. Great. So like swapping one out. Wanda said limiting the amount of alcohol you buy or keep in the house. That's excellent. Keeping the client's alcohol in a cooler run by staff so they can limit their intake. Absolutely, Robert. So like, type of alcohol. There you go. So what Robert just said about keeping the alcohol, kind of away or locked up somewhere, we did that. I've done that with money for people who loved scratch offs. I hate scratch off lottery tickets. They are the bane of my existence. After you've worked in community mental health, and you've managed anyone's money, I think you start to really hate scratch off lottery tickets. They are the devil. Sorry to anybody who likes to play them. But, it was me managing the person's money and giving them enough so they could buy like one scratch off ticket a day or two, rather than spending their entire rent check on gambling.
So I think the point you're making, Dawn, is that we do harm reduction all the time.
We do.
With ourselves. And it's just what's happened is I think it's become sort of contained and stigmatized in addictions and maybe to a greater degree with people with mental illness, where now all of a sudden it's become like none of the things that we were talking about before. Some of the suggestions were controversial, but most of them were not. Because in addictions recovery, a lot of the battle it's just substitution. It's just substituting one thing for another, and you don't go from A to Z without going through all the letters. So what are the other letters? What's the next step? And okay, that next step might be, something like using a computer in a public area instead of in your own room. Or it might be these suggestions, a lot of excellent suggestions that you guys came up with. So it's not something that happens in isolation where that person can lapse back in. Because we already know if we don't put a more adaptive new behavior in its place, you don't just get rid of the old behavior. If you just get rid of the old behavior, the person either relapses back into it after a period of white knuckling, or they substitute it with something else equally or even more harmful.
And let's not forget that some behaviors should not be stopped abruptly because a person can get very ill or die.
Sure.
And so that is something that we also have to keep in mind, especially, alcohol consumption. It comes to mind.
So to me, that's always the perspective of what's the next step? Because what you're dealing with at your level regarding mental health and addictions treatment, it's not mild. It's probably not even moderate. It's on the severe side. So what is that next step forward? Now, even if abstinence is the long-term goal, abstinence may not be the route to get there. And then in some things, like we were just talking about, some things abstinence is not even a desirable state of affairs, much less possible.
Yes, a food addict cannot be abstinent from food.
Right.
Yes, I am speaking as one. Okay, let's move on to the next slide. I've tried it, doesn't work so well. And you end up gaining more weight in the long run because you mess up your metabolism.
Well, that's of course the cycle. The cycle is I will deny myself, and then the urge and the need for that thing will actually grow. And very often when people relapse, they shoot right past where they were before. Now it has all this momentum behind it. So that's why when the person does have a relapse, it isn't I'll pick a nice example and say it isn't well, I quit smoking for a week and I had one cigarette relapse. No, it's I stopped for a week. So I smoked what I would smoke in a week in a day. Once I start, it doesn't stop because it has all this momentum behind it. So these were some of the other examples, just looking at things that people do for harm reduction, in a more global sense. Next slide. So just to map this out, and this is sort of a CBT approach, and I'm seeing Rachel's suggestion. That's absolutely true. It's absolutely true that the risk of overdose, the risk of withdrawal, it's the old, I guess it's the old Freudian thing where if you hold something down and repress it, as soon as you're distracted, it comes up, and it comes up with a vengeance. So that's one of the reasons why there's this sort of all or nothing philosophy can actually be dangerous. So the unconscious process, there's a trigger going on. There's something going on that is triggering the target behavior that leads to the consequence. And the person goes around this cycle again and again and again in an unconscious sort of manner. Eventually a tolerance can build up, and it can get worse, Part of this is the person doesn't realize what the trigger is and what it's doing. If there is a trauma background to it, they may not realize the role that trauma plays in it. The example I gave about the woman going to bed, she didn't make the connection. She didn't say, I don't feel safe going to bed because of the abuse I suffered as a child. She didn't say that. It just went right to the behavior. And it took a while to excavate to that, to the point where she could say, you know what, that's what that is. That's what's going on. My favorite quote about that level of insight is when a person said, I recognized it for what it was. Because what we see, the trigger, is that part of the iceberg that we see. But then all of this other stuff, like the trauma, is the part of the iceberg that the Titanic actually hit, which was below the waterline. It's not the part that you see, but it's connected to it. So the trigger is actually an opportunity for us to view what is this larger process going on. And one thing I'm realizing, as part of this process is that this requires a lot of coordination between who's providing housing and who's providing treatment. And I don't want to presume to assume what that relationship is like where you all work. I know in New Jersey, sometimes the housing and the treatment are separate. So the communication between those two things aren't so good. And in other times, they're sort of hand in glove so that they work well together. So things that are discovered in the therapeutic process get communicated to the housing so that they can be done in concert. So for example, the therapist communicates with the evening shift and says, hey, look, the reason that I'm going to make up a name and say Mary, that Mary has all these problems between 10 and 12 at night is because of this past abuse. And we're working on it. So it may actually spike up and we may see a little bit more of it. But she's also identified things that might help her feel safer during this time, or things that make her feel particularly unsafe during this time. And how can we mitigate that in the setting where she lives? So we have the trigger, the target behavior, which comes up unconsciously, and then the consequence that comes up from it. Next slide, please. So to try to fix this, or one of the processes that we try to do to replace this is, first of all, let's recognize the trigger for what it is. What is this thing? And then more importantly, where does it come from? How does it conjure things? Think about a song that you can hear that will remind you of a person and cause you to feel a certain way. I don't want to get into that, but I know that automatically now there are people in here with songs in their head thinking about people. That's how powerful and how quickly that works. Memory and emotion are basically next door neighbors in your brain. So what's on the right side of this here? So first of all, we identify what the trigger is and hopefully be able to identify what it represents, whether that's trauma-based or not. Over on the right here is the 3 C's: catch it, check it, change it. And I'm seeing an excellent point coming in from Tracy, that is vice versa as well. Working as a therapist, usually I get to hear lots of great stuff from the person who actually sees the person more than I do. They actually see that bedtime routine, which I don't get to see. So very often that provides the missing pieces that I can use. So you're right. That's a reciprocal relationship. So on the right here, catch it, check it, change it. So, okay, what's this thing that's happening? Does it make sense with what's going on right now? Or is it something that's coming from somewhere else, such as an old response to trauma? And then change it. What is a substitute behavior going to be? What's that next step if we're going to modify that behavior to one degree? And that can be anything from punching a wall to punching a cushion on a chair, to from actually acting out in a physical manner to acting out in a verbal manner. And I've got bad sound, I think. So how do we do catch it, check it, change it to begin to modify that behavior? Because if you identify the trigger and then that substitute behavior comes in, now the outcome changes. Now we've started a pattern of change, and many small cycles within that change. And the eyes and ears, that's a great point. So I'm sure we didn't give all of the examples of how this works. I'm looking forward to hearing some examples and situations that you guys are dealing with. So, and I'm also curious about hearing about your own experience with this, about how do you make gradual incremental change, but change that moves in the right direction, as opposed to maybe that step too far. So the floor is open to questions, all that stuff.
Ken, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to scroll back to Michaela, because she gave some great examples in the chat. I'm just going to kind of read off what she has here. She had some examples. She has questions about how to use holistic harm reduction in permanent supportive housing as it refers to resident needing surgery but is struggling with a substance use disorder. The surgeon will not operate until they're sober. The physical health needs of the resident are beyond the capacity of the supportive housing program.
That's a really good one. So the first thing is, now obviously we know what the goal is. The goal is we're saying, okay, we want this person to be sober so that they can go through with this process. Now, it's interesting. While we were talking about that, I was thinking about the motivational interviewing aspect of this. We've done some trainings on motivational interviewing. I believe we did them last year, and we're actually going to be doing them in May and June as well. And this is a situation that's really good for that, because the things that we're going to have to explore are, what are the motivations? What are the things that are keeping that person drinking versus the motivation to get this surgery done? So just like we were talking about before, what are they medicating? What are the things that are driving this behavior? Because it's real obvious from our side, from the helping standpoint, saying, hey, well, look, you need to stop drinking because you need to get this surgery. Okay, that's nice and simple, but that also doesn't capture what's really going on. There are things going on with this person's drinking that to a degree outweigh or overpower the motivations for surgery. Or maybe there's some things going on with surgery that person is afraid of. There's some ambivalence there. So we got to capture both sides of that ambivalence. What's driving both sides, the argument for and against change.
Another example that she has is hoarding. So we've talked, we touched on hoarding, but we didn't get into the ways in which to really mitigate that in a direct way. But she has an individual who is hoarding and not engaging in mental health services, and they're getting to the point where they're going to lose their housing because they cannot get items reduced in the unit and the safety risk is too high. Obviously, I'm sure it's a risk to themselves and other residents.
Yeah, that's a tough one. If that person is not even willing to engage therapeutically, that puts you guys that really sort of handcuffs you guys to a certain degree. One of the things we talk about in motivational interviewing is assessing what stage of change that person is in. So pre-contemplation is this is not a problem for me. I don't have a problem. My landlord has a problem. You have a problem. Everybody else has a problem. I'm not sure what stage this person is in. The next stage would be, contemplation, which is I have a problem, but I don't know what to do about it. That's sort of knowing both sides of the equation, but feeling powerless to do anything about it. Assessing that is pretty important because that determines to a certain degree what your intervention is. Because in pre-contemplation, the intervention is usually more limit setting oriented, more sort of a bottom line thing. And the steps would be, one room at a time, one location at a time, or 15 minutes. 15 minutes has to happen, toward this at a time. If someone is in contemplation, we're back where we were talking about before with the example of the person drinking and going into surgery, which would be, all right, what are the motivations for and against? How do we match those up against each other so that we can enhance that person's motivation to change? And in the harm reduction philosophy, it's what's the next step? Let's not get from where we are to where we want to be. What's the first step? I'm a bit of a neat freak, and I have lots of hoarding in my family. So one of the things that I've noticed about myself is I have to answer a ritual with a ritual. So for example, when my house has really suffered from the fact that it's been my home office for the last year, for some reason, I start with the sink. For some reason, the sink is where I start. I will start with the sink, and then I will emanate out from there. But for some reason, that's the ritual for me that I just have, because it's small, it's achievable, and I heard the SMART reference before, which is really, really good. It's something that's small, it's very doable, it's easy to the point of laughable, except it's not laughable because I haven't done it. So then I start with the sink, and then from the sink, I move to the next, and I move to the next. And it becomes a process from there, because the whole process, the whole job is too big. I don't know if you've ever, in the book called Midnight in the Garden of Good and Evil, if any of you, I've seen the movie, but the book is great. It talks about how a big job defeats you because it's so big, but a big job is really 1,000 small jobs all mashed together. So the trick is, how do you just start beating these small jobs? So if you're fixing up an old house, the example they gave was, you know what, I'm just going to level this one windowsill. That's all I'm doing today. I'm leveling one windowsill. Well, how goofy and how small is that? Well, first of all, leveling that windowsill might take you the whole day, first of all. And secondly, leveling that windowsill is one step beyond where you are now. And then when you get that done, maybe you look at the next windowsill, or maybe you look at what the next job is. Because that's the problem. The person, and I think we can all relate to this, when we're a little stressed, we have isolated things that we're stressed about. When it turns into the big ball of stress, now it becomes, it just becomes unapproachable. So how do we break it down into these small, tiny steps so that we can take them on? So the sink first, or that's my example. For that person, it might be something else. There might be one small place that's easy, that's a place to start. And then it's the journey of 1,000 miles, single step from there. And I'm seeing lots of interesting resources come in, which we're going to have to add on to this.
Yeah, this is great. I'm writing them down. One of the things that I will do is I will download the chat, and I'll try to extract some of those resources and suggestions out of there, and perhaps send them on when we send the materials on to Kimberly in Washington, so you all can get some of those resources as well.
I'd also encourage you, doing the to-do list and breaking big jobs into smaller jobs is a kind of an area of interest of mine. In addition to the link for the website that we're going to show you at the end that has all of our program videos on it, including videos about some of the things I've talked about, stages of change, motivational interviewing, all that kind of stuff. There's also, if you go on my YouTube channel, if you look up Ken Kinter, there's one called Ultimate To-Do List. And this is like an ongoing project for me, but it's specifically about how you turn those big jobs into series of smaller jobs that can then be taken out one step at a time. It's a method for breaking that big ball of stress down into something that's manageable, so that people can make progress on it that way.
I'm sorry, I'm reading the chat. There's
I
some
am too. I am too.
amazing experiences that you all have had and ways that you found to work through. And I was just looking at I'm sorry, I have to scroll up. Tracy, you mentioned an individual having, excessively experiencing auditory hallucinations and how distressing that can be for an individual. And for this individual, she was referencing mail that was in her unit. And so you were able to lock that up in a lockbox. And this brings to mind other behaviors related to hallucinations. One of my most favorite individuals that I worked with was an individual who on a routine basis, it sounds like your individual you worked with experienced distressing and demeaning auditory hallucinations to the point where he would blast the television, the stereo, and like anything he had in his apartment, which we eventually had to get him like a little standalone unit because he was so loud in trying to drown out the voices. And when that didn't, work, we eventually, and he was very opposed to headphones and things like that. Eventually, we were able to get him to the point where he utilized headphones instead of turning everything on in his apartment. But it really was creating a difficult situation, not only for his neighbors, the landlord, but his own electric bill was sky high and he couldn't afford it anymore. So it actually took for him to see the electric bill and how it was affecting his ability to buy, this is horrible, sounds horrible, but cigarettes, to get him to start to change some of those behaviors. And we had to choose this noise-making behavior to start with rather than smoking and these other things, because this was the thing that was going to make him homeless and probably back in a hospital or maybe incarcerated. And so we had to focus on this noise issue, which, in the grand scheme of things, you could point to him smoking pot every day, him drinking, him smoking cigarettes, like chain smoking in his unit and spending money on the cigarettes and lottery. But that's not what was going to get him kicked out. So I think it's also like us looking at what are those behaviors that we need to work on that may not be the most lethal behaviors that we could think of, but in terms of supportive housing, also what's going to jeopardize the housing.
Yeah, that was one thing I was trying to look up for this presentation and didn't find, and it was about the priority of behavior. So for example, if looking at levels of behavior and the disruption that they cause. So for example, you have behaviors that are directly dangerous to self, others, and property. Those are like the most severe. Then underneath that, you have ones that are treatment jeopardizing. And I would say treatment jeopardizing / housing jeopardizing, as that next level. So sometimes we get lost. There are so many problem behaviors and so many different things going on that we get lost in them. And I think here, obviously the focus is what are the ones that are threatening that person's, residence, their tenancy, where they live. But then what are each of those things that person's dealing with? And then again, breaking that down into smaller steps. What are the things that we can actually touch on? Something as small as smoking outside instead of inside. No one's telling you can't smoke, but the where and the when, just working on the details of it. And to be honest with you, that's empowering. Once people start making progress on those little things, then maybe they're more motivated to take on some of those bigger things. But the big things, one of my favorite questions to ask in the change process is, why hasn't this happened already? And there's usually a very good answer to that question. And that is what, in my position, that's what I'm going to have to take on. How do we address that? Whether it's a physical thing or whether it's a belief that the person has, that's sort of the either the enemy of change or the advocate of, keeping things the same.
And Tracy mentions that she has some experience working with special education kids and using positive behavioral reinforcements to discourage negative behaviors. So I think that's also an excellent point, Tracy, in that, we know that punishment, any of you who have children, punishment doesn't work so well. My son, who I've been punishing for 2 years by taking away the Xbox and everything else, he still doesn't do his math homework. Um, we're still, I'm not even going to tell you how many lessons or how many homework assignments behind. But yeah, so it's finding that positive to celebrate, right? And to reinforce. And that can be super challenging sometimes. Especially when you're working with an individual who has a ton of challenging behaviors and you're looking for that glimmer, that little diamond in the rough, right? Like, what is that thing I can celebrate and reinforce? And really, it takes patience to find those things sometimes, but any little bit of movement in the right direction is what we want to celebrate.
Right. Small wins are key, particularly at the beginning. And they're also relationship building. And that's, maybe one thing we haven't given enough credit to in this is the power of the relationship in making change. It's usually not, very often it's not something brilliant that we said or did. It's just the strength of that relationship.
And I think it's also showing up. And I think one of the things that our clients experience that maybe we don't, or we haven't in our developmental, our lifespan development. But it's that idea of I'm all alone, I'm abandoned, you're going to abandon me again, you're another staff who are going to be here for a couple years or maybe a few months, and then you're going to move on. So, and many of our individuals that we work with have experienced that throughout their life, being abandoned, or at least that feeling of abandonment, which is traumatic. And so also showing up and being consistent with them, even while these behaviors are still going on, I think is a very important place to be. Obviously, you don't want to put yourself in danger and you don't want to be present when somebody's using drugs. But consistently showing up and not necessarily punishing somebody because they are still in the throes of this challenging behavior is, I think, important.
Yeah, I would connect that also to Dawn's earlier discussion about the relationships. I would love to see something that indicates, all right, what behaviors do people engage in that cost them their housing? How often is it addictive behaviors? How often is it, those people that are living in the units that shouldn't be there? All that kind of stuff. But that part where that person who may have been in the system a while and there've just been people coming and going from their lives may be very susceptible to having those, abusive relationships. The relationship where, hey, you've got a place to live and I don't, or you've got a place that I can deal out of, or even a romantic, sexual, or companion type of relationship. There's a lot of susceptibility to that with a lot of people that we work with. And so how do we help rebuild that person, or at least stop them from getting into these negative behaviors? So
I'm sorry, Ken, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, I think that's, as much as we were looking at the behaviors, I think behaviors and relationships both need to be looked at, and they're complicated. But they're very complicated. And I'm glad that Dawn brought up the sexual piece of that, because I always think that that's the silent reason things happen. Like if someone stops taking their medication and they don't tell you why, it's sexual side effects. If someone's living in the house and they don't tell you why they're there, okay, well, it's probably a girlfriend-boyfriend situation.
And now you know why this is the subject of my dissertation, because I believe that so many things go back to sex. But I think that it's, sex fulfills, and we're not going to get into a whole conversation about sex, but just to highlight why we did mention it in this, and why we mentioned is because it does meet or attempt to meet a lot of needs for people, right? Whether it's closeness, whether it's trying to escape feeling lonely, whether it's connection, whether it's just to feel good, and have fun for a little while, right? That's part of it as well. So when I typed into the chat box, it's really important to have people tell us their story rather than tell us what's wrong with them. I think that when we start to talk about these risky behaviors or addictive behaviors, or just these behaviors that seem to present a challenge in housing, we want to understand like what is the context, like how do they fit into the context of their life experience. And so having folks tell us what their experience has been, rather than what's wrong with them or what we read in a chart, I think is super helpful in understanding those, like that context.
Yeah. So
Wanda,
an exercise that we didn't bring up in this training, but we've done it in other ones, is one of the things I would ask you to do in working with your clients is it's something called the middle path. Down the left-hand side of a page, you make a list of, all right, here's where the person is. Down the right side of the column, it's here's where I want the person to be. And ultimately you have them do it themselves. They can fill out their own column of where they want to be. And then in the center column, it's what's the first step in that direction? What's the first small step? It could be a phone call. It could be an email. It could be a 10-minute walk. It could be anything. But the hardest part is just getting started. The first 15 minutes of change are the hardest part to do. I compare it to pushing a car. The hardest part is pushing it. And I owned a Chevette years ago, so I have lots of experience with pushing cars. Getting it from a stop to that first 5 miles an hour is the whole battle. So how do you, instead of trying to take on the whole thing, what's that first step that helps? And there was a piece about grooming. That's another issue about the relationships. Our clients might be susceptible to being prey for a predator type situation because they may have, everybody has a need for a relationship.
and predators are good at figuring out what that need is and meeting it, at least on the surface.
The job of a predator is identifying prey. And the first thing that you do as a predator is isolate your prey from the herd. That's your first job. Whoever you split off is who you're gonna follow out. And that looks like not talking to the staff, not connecting with people, separating from everyone else that are your supports.
Okay. So some excellent conversation here. Does anybody have any questions at this point in time, or any of the slides that you want us to revisit at this point in time, before we start to wind down? We did include a slide of references, which also does include a website, a harm reduction website with some of the basic principles of harm reduction. And we have also added in our Rutgers, our projects website, which I'm going to type in the chat box.
Yeah, we have about 30 videos there, some of which we've referenced here, some of which are about completely other things like trauma and all that kind of thing. So they're free. You can pick those up. There's a post test. There's a certificate of attendance if those help. But it's a good next step. And I feel like we've actually started a conversation here that should probably be continued. Like this was a beginning more than an end of things, because we probably could bear to go into greater detail with some of these specific situations. So that might be something that we look into going forward.
Oh, look, and there's Ken. Oh,
there I am.
well, you all get to see the wind beneath my wings, my 13-year-old. So he's so fabulous.
He just finished telling him that he has to do his math homework. I know that face.
Thank you everyone for joining. If you have any feedback, obviously you have our email on the slides, and I think we will be looking at, so maybe later on this year, Ken and I will be together again, I guess, in a couple months or next month and the following month, providing motivational interviewing and motivational interviewing and stages of change trainings in so middle of May and middle of June. And we will probably look at maybe adding on to this training. Thank you. He's not so cute anymore. He's 2 years older, so now he's actually 13. Well, he'll be 13 in less than a month. So,
Oh, clean. Oh, no, clean. Anything
add,
but
add,
that.
add some more pimples to that face, and you and much less groomed these days. Oh yeah, yeah, he really should. He should go. It's either acting or he's going to be a defense attorney, one or the other. We're not sure which. Well, I'm leaning towards defense attorney because he can work his way out of anything.
Good money there. Go with that.
So thank you all for joining us. Like I said, we will be sending these materials on to Washington, and you'll get them within the next week. The recording of the presentation and also the handouts, any other materials. So thank you all for joining. Be safe, be well, and happy spring.
And catch you next time.